I still remember the cold of it. Not the phone itself, the feeling. Like picking up something that shouldn't exist. It was a Tuesday morning and Ronald had already left for work, kissing my forehead the way he always did, the way that used to feel like warmth. I'd just come off a 12-hour ER shift and hadn't even slept yet. But the bedroom was a wreck and I am, at my core, a person who needs order, occupational hazard of triaging trauma for a living. So I was tidying, making the bed, picking up Ronald's clothes from the floor because apparently a man who manages $2 million portfolios for a living cannot locate a laundry basket. That's when I saw it, wedged between the nightstand and the wall. A cheap prepaid flip phone. The kind that comes in blister packaging at a gas station counter. My husband carried an iPhone 14 Pro. Synced his laptop, his car, his Apple Watch. So why did he need this? My fingers were shaking before I even opened it. No password. That was the first thing that struck me, not as a relief, but as an insult. He hadn't even tried to hide it well. After 11 years of marriage, I apparently didn't warrant the effort of a 4-digit lock. The messages loaded. I'd handled a GSW at 3 a.m. without flinching. I'd told a mother her son wasn't coming back. But reading those words, I felt my stomach drop the way it only does when the thing you feared most turns out to be real. 2 more months. Once the transfer's clear, we disappear. The Bahamas is waiting. The Bahamas. We'd honeymooned there, 5 days of nothing but ocean and each other. I used to tell Ronald, half joking, half meaning every word, someday I want to go back and never leave. And here was that dream, handed to someone else. The contact was saved as a single name. J. No last name. Just J. I scrolled up. Months of messages. The morning light was coming through the curtains and I stood there in my scrubs, reading, while the life I thought I had quietly dissolved around me. I still remember the cold of it. Not the phone itself, the feeling. Like picking up something that shouldn't exist. It was a Tuesday morning and Ronald had already left for work, kissing my forehead the way he always did, the way that used to feel like warmth. I'd just come off a 12-hour ER shift and hadn't even slept yet. But the bedroom was a wreck and I am, at my core, a person who needs order, occupational hazard of triaging trauma for a living. So I was tidying, making the bed, picking up Ronald's clothes from the floor because apparently a man who manages $2 million portfolios for a living cannot locate a laundry basket. That's when I saw it, wedged between the nightstand and the wall. A cheap prepaid flip phone. The kind that comes in blister packaging at a gas station counter. My husband carried an iPhone 14 Pro. Synced his laptop, his car, his Apple Watch. So why did he need this? My fingers were shaking before I even opened it. No password. That was the first thing that struck me, not as a relief, but as an insult. He hadn't even tried to hide it well. After 11 years of marriage, I apparently didn't warrant the effort of a 4-digit lock. The messages loaded. I'd handled a GSW at 3 a.m. without flinching. I'd told a mother her son wasn't coming back. But reading those words, I felt my stomach drop the way it only does when the thing you feared most turns out to be real. 2 more months. Once the transfer's clear, we disappear. The Bahamas is waiting. The Bahamas. We'd honeymooned there, 5 days of nothing but ocean and each other. I used to tell Ronald, half joking, half meaning every word, someday I want to go back and never leave. And here was that dream, handed to someone else. The contact was saved as a single name. J. No last name. Just J. I scrolled up. Months of messages. The morning light was coming through the curtains and I stood there in my scrubs, reading, while the life I thought I had quietly dissolved around me. 11 years. A mortgage. A joint savings account. Sunday dinners where he'd reach across the table and squeeze my hand. All of it, every single moment, suddenly felt like a costume he'd been wearing. And I'd been too exhausted, too trusting, too busy saving other people's lives to notice he was robbing them blind. I went to work that night. I know how that sounds. Your husband is planning to vanish to the Bahamas with another person and $2 million that doesn't belong to him, and you go to work. But that's the thing about the ER, it doesn't care about your problems. Bay Ford doesn't pause because your marriage is a crime scene. The monitors keep beeping. The gurneys keep rolling. And somewhere in that relentless, merciless rhythm, I found exactly what I needed. Distance. I sutured a laceration at 9 p.m. and didn't think about Ronald once. I intubated a man at midnight with hands so steady you'd think nothing in my world had shifted. That's what 12 years in emergency medicine does to you. It teaches you to file the unbearable into a drawer and lock it. Deal with what's in front of you. Everything else waits. But the drawer was never fully closed. Between patients, in the brief stillness of the supply corridor, my mind was somewhere else entirely. Not grieving. Calculating. I kept hearing Ronald's voice from our early years. You're the smartest person I know, Maggie. You just never apply it to anything outside that hospital. He'd meant it as a compliment once. Now it felt like a dare. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I hadn't cried once. I'd also sketched out, in the margins of my own mind, exactly how I was going to take everything he thought he'd hidden. Every single cent. He slept like a man with a clean conscience. That was the part that almost broke me, almost. Ronald on his side of the bed, breathing slow and even, one arm tucked under his pillow the way he always slept. Peaceful. Unbothered. While I sat 3 feet away in the dark with my laptop open and my heart somewhere between fury and focus. I'd spent my lunch break down a rabbit hole on the hospital's guest Wi-Fi, a network that couldn't be traced back to our home address. VPNs, offshore account structures. The kind of digital architecture that people like Ronald used to hide money from people like his clients. I'd taken notes in the same shorthand I used for patient charts. Efficient. Invisible. Now I was putting it to use. His passwords weren't as clever as he believed. I'd watched him unlock his laptop 100 times over 11 years of marriage, the same way I'd unconsciously memorized his coffee order, his shoe size, his mother's birthday. Loving someone means absorbing them without even trying. He'd never considered that intimacy could be a liability. I moved carefully. Deliberately. The way you do when you're extracting something fragile from a wound, no sudden movements, no room for error. The first transfer cleared at 2:17 a.m. Ronald shifted in his sleep and I didn't flinch. I just watched the confirmation number populate on the screen and thought about all the Tuesdays I'd come home exhausted while he'd been planning his escape. Then I made the second transfer. March 15th fell on a Thursday. I know because I'd circled it in my mind the way you mark a patient's critical window, the date Ronald had set for the final transfer to Jay. The date they were supposed to become ghosts together. I'd been counting down to it not with dread, but with the quiet patience of someone who already knows how the procedure ends. I was at the hospital when it happened. I didn't need to be home to watch it. I could picture it perfectly, Ronald opening his laptop at the kitchen table with his morning coffee, pulling up the account and finding nothing. Not a delay. Not a glitch. Nothing. The kind of zero balance that doesn't make sense until it makes devastating, irreversible sense. My phone buzzed at 7:43 a.m. Then again at 7:44. 7 missed calls by the time I stepped out of a trauma bay at 8:15. I listened to the first voicemail. His voice was doing something I'd never heard before, a high, tight scramble between anger and panic, like a man who'd just realized the ground beneath him was gone. He needed me to call him back. It was urgent. It was an emergency. I almost smiled at that word. Emergency. He had no idea who he was saying it to. I pocketed my phone and walked back to my patients. By the time my shift ended, Ronald had called 11 more times and the FBI had called him once. They came on a Friday morning, 2 of them, in the kind of unremarkable sedan that tries too hard to look ordinary. I opened the door in my scrubs, hair still damp from the shower, and let the exhaustion on my face do the talking. 12 years in the ER teaches you that people believe what they expect to see. They expected a blindsided wife. I gave them one. Agent Reeves did most of the talking. Soft voice, careful eyes. The kind of interrogator who builds rapport before he builds a case. He was good. Under different circumstances, I might have respected it. They asked about Ronald's accounts, his travel plans, whether I'd noticed anything unusual in his behavior recently. I answered everything slowly, like a woman still assembling the wreckage of her own life. I let my voice catch in the right places. I let the silence stretch when they mentioned Jay's name, not because I was performing grief, but because the grief was real. That was the thing about my performance. I didn't have to manufacture the pain. It was all true. Every bit of it. The betrayal, the humiliation, the 11 years I'd given to a man who'd been planning his exit while I worked night shifts to help pay down our mortgage. I just didn't mention what I'd done about it. When they left, Agent Reeves paused at the door and told me I was handling things remarkably well. I thanked him and closed the door softly. Then I went and made coffee with perfectly steady hands. He came back on a Sunday. Not to reconcile, I want to be clear about that. Ronald didn't come back with remorse or luggage or any of the things a husband brings when he's trying to save something. He came back wild-eyed and unshaven, wearing the same shirt he'd had on 3 days earlier, smelling like airport hotels and desperation. He came back because he had nowhere else to go and someone to blame. He found me at the kitchen table drinking tea. The accusations started before he'd fully closed the door. Where was it? What had I done? Did I have any idea what I'd cost him? His voice kept cracking at the edges, that same high panic I'd heard in the voicemails, except now it had curdled into something uglier. He stepped toward me, and I didn't move. I set down my mug. I want you to think very carefully right now, I said, about what you're about to do next. He stopped. I work with trauma nurses, Ronald. Women who know exactly what a defensive bruise looks like, how to photograph it, how to document it for a federal case that is already open and already has your name on it. I kept my voice the same temperature I use when I'm delivering a terminal diagnosis. Steady. Certain. Kind, almost. So whatever you came here to do, I'd reconsider. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I watched 11 years of marriage leave his face, and what replaced it was something I didn't recognize. Good. Jay's real name was Jordan Mitchell. I learned this the same way I learned everything else during those weeks in fragments, through news alerts and courthouse whispers and the particular satisfaction of watching a story unravel in public that you already know the ending to. Jordan was 29. A CFO's assistant at Ronald's firm. The kind of position that comes with access to calendars, to client files, to the quiet architecture of other people's financial lives. She was arrested on a Wednesday morning outside her apartment complex. I watched the brief news clip on my phone during a break between patients. She looked younger than I'd imagined. Smaller. I'd spent 2 months constructing a villain in my mind, and what the camera showed me instead was a frightened young woman in handcuffs who'd made a catastrophic decision and was only now understanding the full weight of it. I won't pretend that didn't complicate things. The affair had started 26 months before I found the phone. 26 months of dinner reservations I hadn't questioned, late client meetings I'd been too tired to challenge, weekend conferences that apparently weren't conferences at all. 2 years of my life running parallel to a story I hadn't been given a role in. The FBI laid it all out with the kind of cold efficiency I usually reserved for myself. Dates. Wire transfers. Hotel receipts. I sat with that information the way you sit with a diagnosis you suspected but hoped was wrong. Knowing doesn't always make it hurt less. Patricia called me every day for 2 weeks after the arrest. She was 68 years old and had raised Ronald alone after his father left, working double shifts at a textile factory to put him through college. She'd told me that story on our second Thanksgiving together, with a pride so pure it was almost painful to witness. She'd believed in her son the way only a mother who'd sacrificed everything can believe, completely, without architecture, without a single load-bearing wall of doubt. Now she called me crying and I answered every time. I'd listen to her grieve the son she thought she knew, making the same small sounds I make with frightened patience, not quite words, just presence. Just warmth through the line. She kept apologizing to me, which was the part one found hardest to absorb. I'm so sorry, Margaret. You deserved better. You always deserved better. I kept working through all of it. Bay 3, Bay 7, the trauma corridor at 2 a.m. The ER doesn't pause for moral reckonings, and I was grateful for that. I needed the noise. I needed the urgency of other people's emergencies to drown out the silence where my conscience used to be. Because the $2 million was still there. Quiet and invisible, distributed across accounts in 3 different countries, growing modest interest while Patricia cried into my ear and Ronald awaited trial, and I changed dressings and checked vitals and told myself I was still one of the good ones. I almost believed it. I didn't have to attend the trial. Nobody asked me to sit in that courtroom every day. But I went anyway, the way you return to a wound you keep telling yourself has healed. I'd prepared myself for Ronald. For the sight of him in a charcoal suit with a public defender beside him, diminished and ordinary in the way that men who've destroyed lives often look when the consequences finally arrive. I'd steeled myself against any residual softness, any ghost of the feeling that used to live in my chest when he walked into a room. What I hadn't prepared myself for were the others. They came on the 3rd day of testimony. Victim impact statements. An elderly man named Curtis Webb, 74 years old, who'd worked 40 years in the Postal Service and lost his entire retirement in 18 months. He read from a handwritten page and his hands shook the whole time. A woman named Denise Okafor, a single mother of 3, who spoke quietly about the college fund that no longer existed and the daughter who'd had to defer her enrollment. I sat in the gallery and listened and felt something shift permanently inside me. These were Ronald's victims. But the money that should have been returned to them, the money that could have rebuilt Curtis Webb's retirement and sent Denise's daughter to school, was sitting in my accounts, collecting interest. I hadn't taken it from Ronald. I'd taken it from them. That truth settled into me like a diagnosis with no treatment protocol. Quiet. Terminal. Mine to carry alone, in perpetuity, beneath the scrubs and the steady hands and the face of a woman who saves lives for a living. I looked at Curtis Webb's shaking hands and thought I did that. And I drove home in silence and went to work the next morning anyway.